In 1962, political satire was nothing new. Neither was making fun of the president. But making a record where somebody did an impression of the president for the full length of it, that was unique. Which of course then meant that other comedians who were slightly less original had to hop on the bandwagon. Today on Comedy on Vinyl, let's discuss 5 albums that ripped off the First Family. I'm Jason Klamm, and this is Comedy on Vinyl. By the end of 1962, The First Family was the best-selling album of all time, comedy or otherwise. It had sold 7.5 million albums, which was almost double the bestseller from just a few years before, which happened to be a musical. Now, what is The First Family? It is one of my favorite albums, at least in terms of its history. I do find it funny. Still, it is imperfect. It is... the recipe for a hit at the time was something that was gently poking fun at political figures, rather than a full-bore satirical assault, which is absolutely not what it was. It was actually started when one of the creators of the album, Bob Booker, saw on the street a JFK coloring book, which happened to be drawn by Mort Drucker from Mad Magazine. After he saw that, he thought, well, why not make a comedy record about the White House? Now, this might not seem like much to you, because we see political satire daily. You have to consider that JFK was the first president to sort of win the presidency. Well, okay, he won it by certain means, but he also though famously was in a debate with Nixon where Nixon looked like a sweaty dirtbag, and Kennedy kept his stuff together and looked good. And that was, it was built on some definite superficiality. And at the time, there was this sort of outmoded idea that you have to respect the office of the presidency, regardless of who is in the office. As we all know, eventually the man he beat in that first debate would eventually go on to be one of the reasons that satirical comedy albums about the president became quite popular. But this is really the start of it. So The First Family, starring Vaughn Meader, who would go on to do almost nothing because JFK was assassinated, which did very much ruin his career, is a gentle parody. Now there was a news report where Jackie O did a little tour of the White House on TV, and that was kind of the basis of this. It's the idea that there's a documentary in the White House. This is a full-length record. It's about 35 minutes. That explores that, and it's fun. There's some very good bits, but it is inoffensive. It is not It is not intended to be offensive. Supposedly, JFK owned several copies of it, thought it was very funny, and it became evident very quickly that this album was going to be a hit. Earlier that same year, Alan Sherman had a big hit with My Son the Folk Singer, and as a result, people were kind of prepared for comedy albums to kind of make the news in terms of sales. But nobody anticipated something as big as The First Family. But when they did, very quickly, because you could churn out records a lot quicker then, it was quicker to press records because there was just more infrastructure built into it. There were a lot of copycats that came about, and they are, I was going to say, of varying quality, but they're all of about the same quality. But what's interesting is the sort of different approaches they took. And that's what I want to talk about today. At Home with the Other Family was this. It is essentially The First Family, but about the Khrushchevs. It stars, among other people, George Segal, who, if you're much younger than me, you might best know him from The Goldbergs. If you're roughly my age, you would probably know him best from Just Shoot Me. If you're older than that, you would know him best from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and a number of other things. If you discovered him here, interesting, weird, but he's the voice of Nikita Khrushchev. And the big surprise on this record, though, is Joan Rivers. I'm going to leave my assessment of performances for the very end, but long story short, it's the jokes are kind of poorly slapped together. The laughter is clearly dubbed. There are some crazy echoes and stuff, like just very weird editing. Again, it's also the same canned laughter over and over again. You want to hop on that bandwagon. It makes sense. Billboard even covered most of the ones I'm talking about today, actually, except for I think one. In an article that came out around the time that this was maybe the first one of them, but they were all roughly around the same time, just talking about how they weren't making any kind of a dent, not compared to The First Family, but, nor actually, I don't even know how much they spent, so we don't know if they made their money back, but you get why they were trying. However, and this was different enough, except for when we get to another record in a minute, the only part of this that made me laugh at all, and I laughed out loud, was Joan Rivers. And it was just one performance. She does a lot of side characters in this. She wasn't Joan Rivers then. Nobody knew her as Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers. She was an actress, and she's great on this. She's very funny, but she's the only funny part of it. Sorry, George Siegel. Good as your Khrushchev might be. Speaking of Khrushchev, let's talk about our next record. Wait, I hear you saying. The Other Family? The same color record? Basically the same cover? Yep. The exact same concept. This is The Other Family, which does have some weird wax pen marks that I can't get off of here. The big difference here is that it's Khrushchev's face on all of his family members, which is hilarious. So there are JFK impressions throughout all of these records, including the Khrushchev ones. I think the touchstone at that point was him saying "Vigor." We will do this with great vigor. He also, of course, had the bridging R that is common in English and other dialects in the UK, is also common in some parts of New England, which is to say, if I were to say to you, Utah is a great state, first of all, I don't know that I'd be telling the truth, only because I've not been there. But somebody who uses a bridging R in their dialect or accent would say Utah is a great state. That is how he might say. The R is in the middle to bridge the two, to sort of separate the... It is a phenomenon that people are still not entirely sure how it got started. Long story short, you either do the bridging R or you don't. A lot of people do Cuber. They would say, well, Cuber is... but they would also just say Cuber because they didn't quite understand how the bridging R worked. It was still funny because everybody got it, right? But he was well known for saying Vigor. In this... The guy doing JFK, vigor is what he says, and that's not the joke. So it doesn't work. It is, I would say, moderately funnier than the last one. There are a few actual laughs. Not a lot. You see the Yucca Rain from Your Cattle Train, which is a parody of See the USA from Your Chevrolet. It's kind of funny if you know old commercials and like that kind of thing. God, this is just old white guy shit. I'm sorry. It doesn't matter. It's not that good. It might be the only music on this. But if you want to get into music, let's talk about our next record. I mentioned earlier My Son the Folk Singer. Now, eventually, Alan Sherman would go on to make records that all began with My Son the, etc. It just became the idea was this is his mother presenting him his music. They were parodies of popular songs. They were all imbued with his Jewishness, and that was part of the appeal. It was also one of the things that has always surprised me that, Middle America seemed to dig it. Long story short, this might be the most clever mixing, at least in terms of concept. This mixes the first family with My Son the Folk Singer, and My Son the did not become a thing until after Alan Sherman released his next record. It's arguable that this might be one of the... he probably didn't know about this record necessarily, but this became associated with him, and if you want to kind of reclaim your own brand just in case, if it were me and I saw somebody else doing this, I'd be like, oh, that's my thing. So who's to say? It may or may not. Again, another terrible JFK impression, but it is all... Music. It's slightly better than the last one. Now, I want to make it clear, though, that there's no real actual singing. It is a guy doing a JFK and singing, Jackie's at home and I don't care. Jackie's at home and I don't care. Jackie's at home and I don't care. That is supposed to be sustained for a whole thing. That is a gag that works for a 2-minute bit on YouTube, preferably, nowadays. And then wanted to suspend it for a whole record. I don't even want to go into the details of how they do this old racist bit with Fidel Castro. It's terrible. Fidel Castro sucked. That's not the issue. The issue, of course, is the racist bit. It's just dumb and terrible. But again, it's a very bad JFK. None of the JFKs are as good as Von Meter, which is, maybe that's faint praise, but that's how it is. One thing that the guy does get right, though, he does say Vigor. But then in the same track, he does say Cuber over and over again. But that's the gag. That's the only gag. There's nothing to this. Christopher Weeks is the name of the gentleman, and right now, his actual name is failing me. I apologize. He went by Christopher Weeks at the beginning. I'll put it here, what his real name is. My God, there are 29 tracks on here, and I can't remember. I just listened to them, and I can barely remember them. Just Jackie's at home, and I don't care. Poor Little Caroline, When You Grow Up. None of these. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Telstar. Great. Nothing. The cover's the best part of this. The one thing this might have over the other records is that it knows that it's a studio album. It doesn't try to be anything else. There's no canned laughter. That, however, cannot be said of our next record. The President Strikes Back, starring Mark London and cast. Your favorite, Mark London. Yeah, same. It is another okay JFK impression. It is more canned laughter. Wow, he says Cuba instead of Cuba, which, whatever. There are more references on this record to the First Family and to Von Meter than the other ones. I almost appreciate the meta nature of it, because if you're going to rip off a record that is... if you're going to rip off a record that is a satire of a thing, so if you're going to parody a satire, which, by the way, rough going, good luck you. The only way to do it was to be extra meta and say, no, this is the real president talking. If it were a better impression, that might be passable. Now, I will admit full ignorance here. I got very excited when I found out Joan Rivers was on that other record. On this record, the voice of Jackie O is Sylvia Miles. Now, Sylvia Miles was Academy Award nominated. So, there are no chumps on these records. Well, there are chumps on these records, but there are two definite non-chumps. Well, George Siegel, too. But definitely two non-chumps in the form of Sylvia Miles and Joan Rivers. So, digging into these, it was kind of fun to get that history. And again, in this record, even though the impression isn't that impressive, as it were, the meta-ness of it is fun. Like, they have them listening to the album. The president makes an album. There are not a lot of records about making a comedy record. There are a few. This is definitely in there, which means I'm going to cover this again at some point when I talk about records in which the making of the comedy record is part of it, or about the making of another. I like when things get excessively meta. So that's the one thing about this that I like. At the very end of this record, you get this moment that you don't get on the First Family because you don't need it, and it does absolutely, it sort of steps outside of itself. Two people are talking and having a conversation, and one of them says something to the effect, you can only make jokes about big men. And then one of them says, with all the jokes they make, he must be a big man. He is a big man. Then you get some claps. Then that way you then know that it's a comedy, and you know that it's well-meaning. It's not well-meaning enough to have a real audience, because there's so much canned laughter. You hear one guy go, oh, ho, 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 about 10 or 20 or 30 different times throughout the record. The same laugh over and over and over. So no points for originality there, which can't necessarily be said for the next album on our list. Now you're going to see I've probably superimposed My Son the President there. That's My Son, no comma, the President. My Son the President by Danny Davis, who was a relatively well-known nightclub comic, but he also did a lot of punch-ups, including for a guy named Dick Davey. I would recommend going to listen to the Dick Davey episode of the Comedy on Vinyl podcast, where I uncovered his true identity. Danny Davis, before he did that, he hopped on the bandwagon too, but his was a whole sketch album about a Jewish guy wanting to run for president. That's the whole bit. This, My Son the President, is the only one that to me feels like it's its own thing. It's still obviously something ripping off the First Family, but it is, maybe it's just because it's not dealing with a bunch of impressions exclusively. There is a main character, and that character is a Jewish guy running for president. His mother doesn't want him to. It's fine. None of these are great, though. As I've established, it's, again, the only one that sort of feels the most original of all these bandwagon jumpers to me. Now, there are more, including a Canadian one that I want to talk about in the near future, but these were the ones that came out just immediately, right away, once the First Family was released. And I think it's interesting because it made political satire, at least in this particular form, and definitely involving impressions. It made it more of a household concept. It made it something that people would welcome into their homes. Whether it meant to be or not, it was kind of subversive. I think there is definitely something to be said for the fact that there are all these records that tried to rip this off. Obviously, there's a cynical cash grab aspect of it, but there is maybe a need that was being met that eventually was even more needed by the time Nixon becomes president, and by the time we've discovered that he's stolen an election, etc., etc., etc. There's so many albums about Nixon. I've written about that, and I'll talk about those eventually too. And again, I will be talking about more of these records that tried to rip off the First Family, including one that never got made by a very famous character actor, and I'm still trying to uncover where those tapes are. If they exist, I'd like to get it out there, even though, it's the same thing. It's going to be the same thing, unless it turns out to be the greatest thing in comedy history. Sure. Hope you enjoyed me talking about these 5 albums. If you'd like more of this kind of stuff, you can go to comedyonvinyl.com. If you would subscribe here, that would be great. If you hit the bell to get notifications, also fantastic. You can follow us at Comedy on Vinyl everywhere you can follow a thing. I'm on Twitter at jklamm and on Instagram at jasonklamm. You can go to jasonklamm.com or just check out stolendress.com for all my podcasts and stuff that I do. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a good thing. Stolen Dress Entertainment.
Hey, it's my turn. Ah!